The new Balance Dataslate is out. Thousand Suns have received some pretty awful updates, so let's go through it and talk about how it actually impacts the Army going forward. Now, for the course of 10th edition, Thousand Suns have been one of the top performing armies in the entire game. Consistently through each update, since the index time frame, they have been consistently performing well. They have won tournaments, and they've been an army that has, in some cases, needed lots of updates to rein in some of the power that they've had. Coming into the Balanced Dataslate, Thousand Suns had a win rate of about 51%. That's not exactly an army that you'd think would need a massive update to correct its win rates or to rein it in. However, that's what we saw come out in this dataslate from Games Workshop. Herein lies one of the biggest problems that a lot of players in 40K have been dealing with, especially when you're playing in the competitive realm, and that often the meta changes so quickly, things get figured out so quickly, that while it is great to see Games Workshop making rapid changes on a frequent basis, they often can course correct before the full picture has really been materialized. In this case, I think Thousand Suns have really been overcorrected beyond what was even necessary. And they're going to go from an army that has been hovering around the 51% win rate to much less than that. Now, Games Workshop has made it very clear in previous updates that they have a gold zone of win rates, which is between 45% and 55%. And when your army is in that range, to them, that means that the army is in a healthy state. So by their own metric, Games Workshop would tell you that Thousand Suns is a healthy army. However, they're here making these types of changes that are going to push it into the unhealthy territory. Now, while some of my takes originally when the codex were coming out might have been a bit hot, they're no different than a lot of other folks trying to figure out what's going to be good and what's not going to be good when it initially comes out. And as I'm telling you this, I still think there's going to be things in the codex that we are working with the latest Balanced Dataslate that are still good. There's going to be gems in there to be found. There will be lists that do well. I think some tournament players will be able to perform at a very high level with this army and do very well. But the floor has been really dropped on Thousand Suns. So the rest of us, the rest of the masses, are going to have a hard time trying to pilot Thousand Suns to quite the same success rate. Now, when these updates come out, there's typically a few different things that change. One is points, another one is FAQs, and the third one is the actual data slate changes or rewrites to the way rules are written in the game. All of these things play a different role in determining how good the army is going to be, how good the rest of the game is going to be, what's going to be good, what isn't going to be good. The main place to start is actually points. So looking at the point changes for Thousand Suns, there's some bright spots, and then there's a lot of really sore spots. So let's hit the negatives first. Obviously, Zangor Enlightened were going to get hit with a point update here. I don't think anybody is going to be anywhere near surprised. The value and the points that were in there were just immense for what they did. We saw the Fatecraster Great Bow Enlightened, the big units, go up by 30 points. Now, it's very rare unless you're talking about big models like Knights or Magnus, units that cost 400, 500 points, a quarter of your army. Games Workshop doesn't make these types of adjustments on units that tend to be down in the 60 and 50 point range and bump them up by 30 points. So it shows you how out of whack those point costs were. And look, it's not going to, again, be a surprise to anybody that they adjusted those. I also don't think 110 points is really outrageous. They might rein that in a little bit and bring them maybe back down to about 100 points for 6. But for now, it's probably still playable. I don't think everybody's going to be just loading up on them at on the 6-man Zangors like they were before. The Spear Enlightened are kind of another oddity in there. So they also received a points update to get, or a nerf, to have their points raised. But it wasn't as much. So you can still take a 6-man Spear Enlightened unit for 90. The big difference is the Bow Enlightened really had the ability to snipe out characters. They shoot really good. They move really fast. You can throw temporal surge on them. There's all sorts of different things that you could do with them that were great. But the main thing was they were just really cheap and really valuable for what they did. The spears just don't offer the same value there. So on one hand, I'm not shocked that the bows got nerfed, but the spears getting nerfed is really kind of a question mark there, because no one was really taking the spear enlightened. It wasn't like, hey, we're loading up on 18, or we'd see 18 bow enlightened, but it wasn't like we were seeing, another 36 enlightened in your list that was just bow and spears. So that was a little bit odd. Elsewhere, we saw some nerfs to things like the Infernal Master, which went up by 10 points. Magnus also went up 15 points. The Mutalith Vortex Beast up 15 points. Rubric Marines caught a little bit of shade at a 5-point update. And Sorcerers also saw a 10-point update. Now, the Infernal Master and the 1,000 Sun Sorcerer, I thought, makes total sense. They are very strong for what they do. They're the cornerstones of most lists. They're the units that you're usually putting in there and plugging in with your Rubric Marine units. The Infernal Master has great value as well as the 1,000 Sun Sorcerer when you give them the Eldritch Vortex in the Grand Covenant detachment. But all in all, again, not a big surprise to see that they're receiving some point updates. The Mutalith Vortex Beast, it seems like it's a little bit overcorrected. Most of the previous updates that we've had, which again, we've played with the Index for a year, and the Mutalith had stronger rules in the Index timeframe, and its points went up back then, during that time frame, went up similarly to about 175 points, maybe more, but then it came back down. And this feels like the same kind of thing where it's a knee-jerk overreaction. The points are going to go up, and then they're going to realize, well, okay, we overdid it, and now they're going to bring the points back down. The Mutalith really, it's not as good as it was in the Index. The fact that in the Index you could double the range of powers really just was a force multiplier for the rest of the army. Adding one to your ritual casts is nowhere near the same power level or the magnification that the rules that it previously had did. It's nice. It also fills a really nice role where it's big and tanky. It can take quite a bit of damage. It can dish out a little bit of damage. Its shooting profile is very appreciable. It's just not worth 175 points. It just fits very nicely in where it was at about 160, 165 points, somewhere in that point range. Rubric Marines, did they need to go up 5 points? I don't think so. They're in every single list, so you're basically nerfing every single list. Are you nerfing it that much? No, you're taking 5 points away. Most lists probably have 3 units of Rubric Marines, so you're probably taking about 15 points in the aggregate away, which means, okay, maybe you're losing an enhancement or something as part of your list. But in general, they didn't really need that. Rubric Marines themselves are perfectly fine in about the 100-point range. It's not worth really getting bent out of shape about, because 105, 100, we're splitting hairs. They didn't make any changes to the 10-man unit. I don't think a lot of people are bringing 10-man units. Most people are, when they do bring a 10-man unit, it's one unit going all in with maybe like a 1,000 Sun Sorcerer or an Infernal Master that gets shoved into a Rhino. You drive them up and you have one big go turn with them and dump them into something. But again, I think you're getting much more value out of just a 5-man and then bringing another 5-man, for a few more points. So, and then the 1,000 Sun Sorcerer, yeah, I think I've touched on. His value is going to be very similar to the to the Infernal Master. Now, the one other change that they made was they made the Eldritch Vortex another 10 points more expensive. Makes total sense why they would do that, because that is probably the best enhancement in the entire game for 1,000 Suns. So out of all the enhancements we have, there just isn't another enhancement that does what it does. You put this on your Infernal Master, you put this on your 1,000 Sun Sorcerer, it amplifies their damage. It's been something we've had since the Index. It was amazing then on the Infernal Master. It's still amazing on the Infernal Master. It's also amazing on the 1,000 Sun Sorcerer. So again, that the point updates make sense. I haven't gotten to the rituals changes. I'm going to get to them in a minute. But when you think about this feels like this would have been enough. This would have been a nice soft touch to the army. You're not you're correcting some of the problems that were very obvious, and you're not getting too carried away with your point updates across the board. I mean, look, the Zangor Shaman receiving 5 points, it's not really worth getting that upset about. I don't think everybody was just jamming as many shamans into the list as they needed. It just seemed like that was something that was being run with the Enlightened, and he caught shade as a result of that. The rest of the army, though, we did receive some bonuses to the robots, and we also received some bonuses to the Scarab Occult Terminators when you bring them in a big unit of 10. So the 5-mans kind of remain where they are. They're not very valuable, really, in 5-man units. Even though at 180 points, it's good value. I mean, you can't make the argument that 5 Terminators for 180 points is really that bad, especially when Scarab Occult Terminators have that always-on -1 to wound. They have a great plethora of weapons to choose from. You've got your missile launcher, your Soul Reaper cannon, you've got your psychic power that's built in there. Like, it's a good unit, but nobody's taking them in 5-mans, because if you're going to invest in them, you need a 10-man. And then with the 10-man, you're going to take the Terminator Sorcerer, who also received an update, and that Terminator Sorcerer is then going to help buff the unit. You're going to get lethal hits on them. You're going to get the other update that they just gave to it. It's just kind of one of those things where the real use case for these guys is not in the 5-man units, like taking 3 5-man units, because the punching power there requires you to dump things like stratagems in there to reroll hits and wounds. So, only other thing to say is, robots got a little bit of a point update. It's nice. They're going to need more. And their rules just are very, very lackluster at the moment. Honestly, just a very big disappointment this edition. Those models don't look good, and they don't really perform very well on the table. I'm sure you can have a lot of fun with them. Infiltrating some stuff, being able to shoot a bunch of missiles off of them sounds kind of cool, but all in all, they're not worth the point investment. Most of the army doesn't want to go get up in the face of the opponent, so it just doesn't really fit very well with everything else. In that vein, the Land Raider, same exact scenario. Okay, great, you gave a 20-point reduction, and it sounded like almost everybody got a 20-point or so reduction on their Land Raiders, but there's no reason to be really taking a Land Raider in Thousand Suns. What are you going to deliver? 7 Terminators? That just... Why? Why are you going to put them in a Land Raider? You can't put a full 10-man in there. You could put 10 Rubric Marines, but you're so much better off than a Rhino, because then you get the +1 to hit and wound. So it's just one of those things that's not making much sense. Now let's talk about the Balance Dataslate updates. This is where Games Workshop basically rewrites rules for things, changes how abilities work, how they function, things like that. These are not just clarifications. These are just wholesale rewrites or changes to the rules. This is where the big update comes. The rituals have basically been really, really handed a huge nerf. We no longer have the ability to attempt to cast the same ritual over and over again, even if we fail it. I want to take a second and just step back a moment and go back to the index. It's important to understand the context of these rules and how they've changed over time here. When the index came out, the index version of the rituals were basically you got points based on your army configuration, which was what was on the table and what was alive on the table from that army configuration or that army list. So if you brought Magnus, you got a certain amount of points at the start of your turn, and as the game goes on, if you managed your what died, then you could manage how many points you had, and you could still continue to use rituals through the game. So that was the way, as a player, you used your skill to play the army well. You managed that as a resource. You had points to manage, where you spent it, how you spent it, what you spent it on. All those things mattered. That's where the player skill came in. The problem with that was that it really left you in a position where there was only one list you could bring because the optimal list generated as many of these points as possible and put you in as best a place as possible to spend those throughout the game. That was all done away with in the Codex, where we no longer have a point system. And I want to point this out because the point system itself was not what the problem was. It was how the points were being generated. The point system actually was one of the best rule sets that Thousand Sons have had in its entire existence. Being able to actually get better at understanding how to use that resource and spend that resource with the army is really what defined a lot of player skill with the army. When the Codex came out, you are now changing that to something that you are not managing resources, you are now managing redundancy. So you are able to cast rituals as many times as you want so long as you continue to fail the ritual. But as soon as you succeeded in casting the ritual, whether it was on 2d6 or 3d6, at that point you could not manifest that again. The only exception, obviously, to that was Doombolt with the enhancement. But the core point here is that you had a chance of failing, which you addressed by bringing multiple sorcerers or multiple psychers to the table, and then putting them in the position that you needed in order to have that rule that you need go off. An example with this would be where you need the rerolls to hit. So if you needed that to go off, what you would do is say, okay, I'm going to position 2 or 3 psychers in a position to be able to get this to go off on the unit that I needed. So that if I fail with the first one, that's fine, I move on to the second one. And if I fail with the second one, I've got a third there as a backup. Stranger things happen. Now, with the Balance Dataslate, the fact that you can only attempt these rituals once means there is no longer any skill involved in managing the army rule at all. And what I mean by that is there is no longer anything as a player that you can do to build around or use your core army rule. And I can't tell you what a disappointment this is, because it makes Thousand Sons the only army in the entire game where that's the case. Every single other army in 40K, you look at the army rule and you think, okay, how do I build my army with this in mind? With Thousand Sons, it's no longer a rule you build around, it's a bonus you might get to have. And that therein lies the problem. They are an army without a core rule that they get to really have something anytime on the table. The only other army that comes close to having something similar to this is World Eaters. And when you look at the way World Eaters rules work, no matter what happens, they get something. Thousand Sons, the floor is you get nothing. You can try to cast a power, and if it doesn't go off, well, sorry, that's it. And you might even, on your first attempt where you just roll 2d6, you might roll 2 1s. And at that point, you just say, well, I'm not casting this turn. And what that means is you can't plan around it. You can't rely on it. These things that the whole army is balanced to, having rerolls, getting additional AP, chucking out mortal wounds with Doombolt, all these things are what you build your army around to rely on as your core toolkit. Nope, you don't get to do that anymore. Now it's just you can attempt and you might get it. And at that point, it's just going to be a bonus. So you basically now are left playing the army without an army rule. And frankly, when you look at the state of the health of all the data sheets that we have in Thousand Sons, they are not strong enough to carry themselves. They're good enough to work within a certain system. Grand Coven is a great system for them to operate in. Unfortunately, it's the only system we have. It's the only one that offers the ability to re-roll a power when it fails, or if you just want to re-roll it. It's the only one there for you to do that. It's the only one that then also gives you bonuses to your psychic powers, like devastating wounds, sustained hits. You have the ability to re-roll hits and wounds. It's the best toolkit that Thousand Sons have. It's not the only toolkit. But the problem is there is a glaring gap in quality between that toolkit and the rest of them. All the rest of them are just very, very weak variations of an idea that might have been cool if they had completed the concept with the stratagems. That's really where they have fallen short, is that the other detachments lack the stratagems to really support the rest of the army in a really significant way. And that's why you see 80, 90% of the players out there remaining with Grand Coven. And when I polled the community, you'll see that there are a number of individuals that are not just abandoning the army at the moment and playing them. They are moving on to other armies, or they're maybe even just completely not playing 40K. So all in all, this change, on top of all the point changes, is probably one of the most unneeded, unnecessary, overhanded updates that an army has received in 40K. It's not the only one. I think other armies have had similar updates happen to them, and they've had to wait months for Games Workshop to come back and course correct. It's unfortunate, but that's the game we play. And finally, the FAQ for Thousand Suns was updated. Now, there's nothing really revelationary in here. A lot of it are things that you can see how certain situations players might ask these questions, or they might declare that, hey, you have to do things a certain way, like declaring all of your Cabal powers all up front, which no, you don't have to do. Nothing really too extraordinary in here or groundbreaking, but just some generic updates and clarifications in here for the most part. So all in all, a pretty low-key FAQ for Thousand Suns. So final thoughts on this. It's been very, very disappointing to see how the rules for Thousand Suns have evolved from where they were in the index, what they came out with in the codex, and where they are today. Obviously, this is a disappointing update with the FAQs, or with the Balance Dataslate and the points, all of those things combined. It's disappointing. There aren't a lot of players that are pretty happy about this. In fact, I see a lot of people just not going to play Thousand Suns going forward, and I can understand that. Games Workshop has to do a better job than this. You can't have an army come out with updates like this when they are in a position that didn't deserve those updates to happen. And everybody sitting here playing the game can look at this and clearly see that this is overhanded. On the flip side, you also shouldn't have the situations like Death Guard, where they sit for months and months with these ridiculous points on their units, and they're not corrected when it's a serious problem. So it's almost like they are misjudging the effect of how bad certain armies are. And I think this is something Games Workshop has to get better at. They are missing the mark right now, getting the rules written correctly for a lot of these armies as well. Thousand Suns specifically have gone downhill since the codex, basically. And you might even go back to the index that they've gone downhill since then. Some of the updates were warranted, and some of them probably not. Players deserve a better rule set to use for their army than what they received. We get one update every 2 to 3 years for our army, and we have to basically sit here and play this army for that period of time. The rules that we have for Thousand Suns are just not good enough. We get no new choices, no new things that really you can be creative with. You're hamstrung in being forced to take certain detachments because the other ones you have won't compete and won't play with the other armies at the same level. So if we're talking apples to apples here, yes, it's fair that there are certain armies that only have one detachment that's good. And right now, Thousand Suns only have one detachment that really is, quote-unquote, good. That might be what their intended result is. But the miss here is the opportunity that they could have taken to really come out with a set of rules that would make a lot more sense. They missed being able to update the detachments in a way so that they worked with the Army rule a lot better than they do. You shouldn't have situations where it feels like there are combos half-baked into the stratagems. Like here's a buff that you're going to receive to these units, and then I go searching for those units and find, well, there's never a situation I'm going to actually use that. Or there's never going to be a situation where that actually benefits the unit. They really missed with the psychic keyword this entire edition. And I was thinking about this the other day, and I realized psychers outside of Thousand Suns don't feel like psychers in the game anymore. When you look at a librarian in Space Marines and you put that on the table, does it really feel like you've put a librarian on the table? There's no psychic power being cast. There's no special ability that they're, hey, hold on a second, I have to take note that this character is doing this. It's just built into the profiles. So on one hand, I do like that. I do like the fact that that streamlines the game. But I think the implementation of it and what they're actually doing, maybe it's not strong enough. Maybe they're not significant enough. And maybe psychers need to be brought up in both their power level and their points and make them a bit stronger. I don't mind that with Thousand Suns, that's their gimmick and that's what it's going to be. And maybe I'm sounding a little biased, sure. But I think I'm looking at it from another army's perspective with their psychers, and that if I put a librarian on the table, there should be something significant that librarian is doing. Not just, hey, I'm another lieutenant or captain with my own set of abilities. And it gets lost in the wash what that character is actually doing or bringing to the table, that it actually is a psycher. I look back at 7th edition and I looked at all the psychic powers that were there. And even when you go to 9th and 8th edition, the one thing that stands out is that you had to put on your characters, you had to choose which psychic powers they had. And what gets missed this edition is that there's no character to that anymore, when now they're all the same. There's no, significance about individual units anymore. Everything is just the same, or it's just variations of it. From a competitive standpoint and a balance standpoint, okay. I refuse to believe that they couldn't achieve both, that you couldn't both have a system that lets you have these characters that are a lot more unique and have character and personality to them, like a demon prince who is really big at, biomancy or, healing himself and, things like that. You can't really get that same character in the game with the current rule sets. And that is disappointing. And I think right now, that's my biggest disappointment with 40K and the way the rules are written, in that you can't really have the fun that you would have had in previous editions. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people are finding, they can have perfectly equal amounts of fun. I just don't think the rules are there to allow players, or the structure, let me put it this way, the structure isn't there within the rule system that they have to let players really get creative. And that's what's missing from 40K. And I think that's also why you're seeing a lot of people say they're not enjoying the game as much as they used to be enjoying the game. So anyways, I'll have another update soon. I have more content coming. I know I have been slow on getting these videos posted. It does take time to, get down and get this stuff recorded and put everything together, but I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.